Welcome, everyone, to our Thursday night history talk with the Milwaukee County Historical Society being co-presented tonight with the Pabst Mansion. We have a really fun talk coming up tonight about the mansions of Milwaukee's Grand Avenue. And so thank you so much for tuning in. We're trying to do these talks here at the Milwaukee County Historical Society every Thursday night. So make sure you keep coming back every Thursday night for more interesting content. My name is John Harry. I'm the Programs Fellow at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. So I'll be introducing our main performance or presentation tonight. But I just want to say, if you want any more information on what's going on at the Historical Society, go to MilwaukeeHistory.net. We have another presentation coming up next Thursday with Tom Fearing, the Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee. So all about Milwaukee's innovation history and some of the cool products that you might not know got their start here in Milwaukee, like the typewriter, things like that. So we'll have that next Thursday at 6:30. So keep a lookout for a Facebook invite on that. And hope you can attend on that one too. It's also coming up on Tuesday. It's a special COVID-19 Giving Tuesday. So make sure you see those announcements and support your local nonprofits, specifically historical nonprofits like the Historical Society and the Pabst Mansion, as COVID-19 is, of course, complicating everything in our world today. But you don't need me to be talking much longer, because we need to make sure that we have our expert on here and our presenter tonight. Let me welcome in. We have John Eastberg. Thanks for joining us tonight, John.
Thanks, John.
And we have this wonderful presentation all about the mansions of Grand Avenue here in Milwaukee, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, welcome, everyone. I'm super excited to be with you all. And I think this is kind of an exciting format to see this lecture, because all these great photos are going to be right in front of you, and you're going to be able to study them up close. And if we were doing it in the traditional way, you wouldn't be able to see quite as great a detail. So I really hope you enjoy tonight's presentation. Just a little introduction into how this topic came about. And almost 20 years ago, which seems unbelievable now, our curator at the Pabst Mansion, Jody Rich Bartz, and I embarked on creating an exhibition of photographs and artifacts from all the mansions that were on Grand Avenue. And probably one of the questions we always receive at the Pabst on tour was, what was the neighborhood like around the Pabst Mansion? Was it in the middle of the country? Was it in the middle of the neighborhood? And quite frankly, 20 years ago, we didn't really clearly know the answer to that. And so we spent months kind of combing through the archives at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, at the State Historical Society. We actually reached out to the descendants of Grand Avenue families that had homes there and put together a wonderful exhibition. And so tonight's program is kind of some of the best elements of that exhibit and the talks that I've been giving over the years on this topic. So the photograph that we're seeing right now was taken on the rooftop of an apartment building very close to where the Milwaukee Public Library is today, which would be kind of on the right screen of your monitor. And so we're looking west, and you're seeing all these amazing trees and all these towers that are kind of cropping up. And this was the most magnificent procession of mansions known in the state of Wisconsin at the end of the 19th century. And so essentially you had 27 blocks from 9th and Grand all the way out to about 35th or 36th Street, just lining all these dozens and dozens of homes. It's hard to even imagine, because hardly any of them are there today. And the Pabst Mansion essentially is the lone survivor, intact with original furniture and artwork. And of course, the Wisconsin Club, too, is one of these great mansions from that era. The street was created, it was kind of a direct kind of dirt road out of downtown Milwaukee called Spring Street initially. During the 1860s and 70s, you started having merchants building larger homes along the avenue. And so those kind of homes begat more homes, and by 1876 the name was changed from Spring Street to Grand Avenue, so you had all these wonderful homes on Grand Avenue, and that building period lasted all the way through right after the turn of the 20th century. And the rise of the automobile and the commercialization of downtown Milwaukee kind of really shifted the dynamic of this neighborhood. So people started moving over to the east side or to the north side or to the west side. But this generation that built Grand Avenue kind of dissipated shortly after the turn of the century. So these homes were really just around for a very short period of time and were taken down sooner than I think most people would think. So that's just kind of a snapshot history of Grand Avenue. And let's start our adventure here. So we're going to start at 9th and Grand, and 9th and West Wisconsin Avenue, if you want, for today. I've included all the addresses. So even numbers are the north side of the street, and odd numbers are the south side of the street, just so you have a frame of reference. So we're going to actually not start on Grand Avenue. We're going to start on 9th Street with the home of Alexander Mitchell. And Alexander Mitchell arrived from Scotland in Milwaukee in 1839. And within a decade, he had purchased a house that we're looking at right now, which was kind of this early Italianate. And what I find interesting about the Mitchell house is that at the, and I'm going to kind of blow the surprise that this is the Wisconsin Club today, but so at the inner core of that house is one of the oldest homes in downtown Milwaukee. So somewhere in that building, you have walls that go back to the 1840s. So Alexander Mitchell was one of our early entrepreneurs, was in banking, the Marine Bank, was in insurance, he was in railroads, he was the president of the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul Railroad. Built up an amazing fortune, and so as his fortune grew, so did his house. And that's a substantial addition that he has just made. So by the 1870s, as I was saying, you know, Spring Street was transitioning to Grand Avenue, and this is one of the things that made it grand. So you had the Mitchells hire one of Milwaukee's preeminent architects, Edward Townsend Mix, to completely reorient the house. And so while they didn't physically turn the house, they did turn the house architecturally. So that's when the 5-story Ampere Tower was added. This large conservatory was expanded on the house, all these pleasure grounds and the Belvedere that we know on the grounds to the Wisconsin Club today was already in the garden. And so it really made this beautiful statement. And this was kind of the gateway to Grand Avenue with the construction of the Mitchell House. And there were some interesting things about the Mitchell House that we should note. I like to think this was the first Mitchell Dome, was the conservatory that was attached onto the Mitchell residence. And the balcony that you're seeing on the right side of the photograph was actually connected to a suite of rooms that were Mrs. Mitchell's private quarters, so she could go right into her conservatory. And she was also one of Milwaukee's great art collectors. And so she had a private top-lit third floor art gallery that she added to the house during that redecoration. For years, this photograph was always misidentified as belonging to, being of the Leighton Art Gallery. But I was like, you wouldn't have a snooker table in the Leighton Art Gallery. And so eventually we had matched up the architecture, and that is indeed that room, and that room still exists today, but not with all the artwork or the snooker table. So the Mitchells had built up a fantastic fortune, probably one of the largest in the state. He, when he died in 1887, had left a fortune of about $20 million, which would be literally hundreds of millions of dollars today. And so that fortune between 1887 and 1893 was almost completely lost in the panic of 1893. So much so that the Mitchell family had to let their house on Grand Avenue go. And so the house went up for essentially for lease. And the fledgling Deutscher Club, which had been burned out of its quarters during the fire at the Stadt Theater, now the Pabst Theater, in 1895, decided to lease the Mitchell House as their clubhouse. And in 1898, they consummated the purchase of the house. They raised Mrs. Mitchell's conservatory, and you can see that here they built a bowling alley on the first floor, a ballroom on the second floor, and this bandshell on the front of the building. For 125 years, the Deutscher Club and its successor, because it changed its name during the anti-German sentiment of World War I, so 1917, it became known as the Wisconsin Club. And here we have Teddy Roosevelt in front of the Wisconsin Club, or the Deutscher Club still then. And this is from the original glass plate negative. I love how laser sharp this photograph is. If you go towards the entrance of the club, you can actually see the cigar smoke rising from a gentleman's cigar. So historic photography is the best. So here we are today, the Wisconsin Club, doing a great job preserving the original part of the mansion and these amazing rooms that still exist from the Mitchell's ownership of the house, as well as the later additions done by the club. So even though it's not a mansion, I always like throwing this in. This is Church of the Jesu, which is kind of surrounded by Marquette's campus. A lot of people think that's the Church of Marquette University, and to some extent it is, but it is its own entity, and it actually predates Marquette's arrival on Grand Avenue for about 14 years. But this photograph was taken around 1893, and I love construction photographs because it really shows how these buildings were put together, always within a relatively short period of time. Jesu took about 2 years to build, and I always like to zoom in on the nave window, and I always say that this definitely would not be up to OSHA standards today when you look at all these crazy ladders and scaffolds and everything to get all the stonemasons and the roofers where they needed to be. So it's pretty amazing. So my mom is not a garage sale shopper typically, but in the 1990s, she happened to go to a garage sale and thankfully bought 2 photographs that were in a box of photographs for 50 cents. And I quickly liberated them from her. And what was particularly amazing about the 2 photographs is that the house on the left was the same in both photographs, but the focus of the photograph, the house in both photographs, was completely different. And so after doing some research, I found out that this was the home of August Bergenthal. And so this photograph that we're looking right now is of the double house that he and another family shared in the 1880s. And around 1895, he hired the architect Eugene Liebert to do a little remodeling. So this is a little light remodeling done by Eugene Liebert to really create this amazing mansion that was lived in by August Bergenthal, who was president of the National Distilling Company, was involved with Red Star Yeast, and really did an amazing job. He hired Cyril Kalnick to do all of the ironwork on the front of the house. This is a photograph that Kalnick actually commissioned to kind of memorialize his work on the Bergenthal home. But you can just see all this amazing detail of stained glass, of terracotta, of the wrought iron. It's just a beautiful home. So the Bergenthals stayed on Grand Avenue until 1916, and they sold to the Ferrick family. And Ferrick Funeral Home was operated out of the Bergenthal mansion until the 1940s, at which point it was acquired by Marquette University and was turned into the Coronado Flats, which were an apartment building. I've always said that it'd be better to go from apartments to a funeral home than a funeral home to apartments. But anyway, it served as the Coronado Flats until 1958, when it was demolished for green space on Marquette's campus. This is just a little house that I've just always been interested in. This was the residence of George Strohmeyer. He was the president of the Milwaukee National Bank. And I didn't understand for a long time the verticality of this house and these amazing windows on the second floor. But as it turned out, he and his wife had purchased a half lot on Grand Avenue. And so that's why it had such an upright position on the avenue. And so the Strohmeyer House remained on Grand Avenue until the early 1950s. It eventually became a frat house for Marquette University before it was demolished in the early 1950s to make way for the Marquette University Memorial Library, which opened in 1953. So going across the street, so now we're on the north side of the street, is the Elizabeth Plankinton House. And normally when I'm giving this talk in person with all of you in the same room, there's always kind of this awe about this house, because this is one of the most storied homes in Milwaukee, and figures predominantly in preservation history, and kind of one of Milwaukee's great mansions for sure. So this was built as a wedding present house by John Plankinton, the great Milwaukee meat packer, for his only daughter Elizabeth, as a wedding present house. She was engaged at the time of the construction of the house to Richard Henry Park, and he was the sculptor who did the George Washington Memorial was on Grand Avenue, but it's in front of the library today in the median. And she had commissioned her, I guess then boyfriend, to do the sculpture, and had donated it to Milwaukee. They became engaged. And then during the construction of this wedding present house, he decided to marry a dancer from Minneapolis. So that marriage was never consummated. And so the house was eventually completed. It was designed by Edward Townsend Mix and completed around 1889. She supposedly walked into the first floor of the house, walked around, walked out, and never lived in the house. And that is borne out by the fact that it sat on the real estate market for 6 years before it finally was purchased by another family. What we didn't know for a number of years was that she traveled extensively throughout Europe, but then would also return back to her father's house. And her father's house is on the right side of this photograph, and in the background, being caught by the morning light, is the Elizabeth Plankinton home that she never lived in. So unfortunately, she had to see the house regularly when she was at her father's house, the home that she would never live in. Eventually, in 1910, the Knights of Columbus purchased the Elizabeth Plankinton Mansion, and it became their clubhouse. And they were there for decades because Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and it was in the 1400 block of West Wisconsin Avenue, or Grand Avenue, even in those days. They changed the number of the house to 1492 West Wisconsin Avenue. And so for decades, this sat on that north side of Grand Avenue and later Wisconsin Avenue. And eventually Marquette's campus was starting to surround it. And preservationists really wanted to find a way to save it. And the Marquette purchased the property, but the Milwaukee Redevelopment Authority owned the house, and that becomes very important to the story. By the late 70s, the Knights of Columbus had left the home, and the Pabst Mansion had been secured through preservation efforts in 1978, so it was hoped that building on that success, the Elizabeth Plankinton House would be saved. The interior was amazing, this great 1880s design, and this is all done in quarter sawn oak and filled with stained glass windows still. It was in a great state of preservation. However, the need for taking it down, and there were so many battles in the newspapers. One of my favorite headlines is "Behemoth blocks progress." And so they were really saying that this house was just not worthy of saving. So the Redevelopment Authority carefully took out much of the interior woodwork in the house as preservation efforts were going on. And on, let's see, on October 11th, 1980, Saturday evening at dusk, literally, this is what happened. The Redevelopment Authority had the eastern side of the Plankinton house taken off and essentially rendered it null and void. And so this, out of this kind of surprise demolition on a Saturday evening came a lot of preservation legislation that one of these kind of spot demolitions couldn't happen again. So out of its end came the saving of other historic structures. And now, as you can see in this photograph, McCormick Hall, or the round tower that was built in 1966, that too has been demolished just last year in 2019. So as we can see, it doesn't stop just with Victorian, but it goes on with mid-century architecture as well. The one final thing about the Elizabeth Plankinton house is all that salvaged material, some of that is still being kept by the Redevelopment Authority here in Milwaukee. And so where some of the materials for the Elizabeth Plankinton house will have their final residing place is yet to be written. So it's interesting, 30 years on, we're still writing the history of this demolition. So now we're going to move across the street. So we're going over to Elizabeth's father's house, John Plankinton, and her brother's house, the William Plankinton home. And here we have them sitting side by side on these very deep setbacks on Grand Avenue. So now we're on the south side of the street. And we will stop at the father's house first. And this was actually had its beginnings in the 1850s as a home for Jason Rogers, who was another early Milwaukee entrepreneur, but he owned hundreds of acres of land on the south side of Spring Street or Grand Avenue or West Wisconsin Avenue, between, say, 15th and 20th, going all the way into the valley. So he owned a lot of property. Eventually, he sells his residence to John Plankinton in 1864. John Plankinton had just made a huge amount of money selling packed pork products to Union soldiers. And so that enabled him to put literally about $100,000 of 1864 dollars into remaking the Jason Rogers house into kind of Milwaukee's showplace. And so this was the great mansion that John Plankinton created. And I highly encourage all of you to go to the County Historical Society, and if you're interested in this topic, to look at the interior photographs of both the John Plankinton and the William Plankinton residence. They're really remarkable photographs that really document probably one of the most elaborate homes to have been built in Milwaukee. Again, I'd like to draw your attention that this is 1870s Milwaukee. So here we have this Japanese-inspired bedroom with the light fixture of gas jets coming out from underneath this pagoda. All the woodwork is done in carved birch to simulate bamboo, and it's just a really high-style room. And so eventually the John Plankinton house and indeed the William Plankinton house were both acquired by Marquette University in the late 19-teens. And as you can see above Elizabeth Plankinton McIntosh's head, the Marquette University used the John Plankinton residence as the speech school all the way up until the mid-1970s. And eventually this house, which was then, parts of it were 120 years old, had essentially outlived their usefulness for Marquette. And so Elizabeth, or Elise, was the great-granddaughter of John Plankinton. And so she is standing at the base of her ancestral tower shortly before it was demolished in 1975. Moving next door to the west was the William Plankinton House, and this was a wedding present home built for his only son. So he was keeping his children close, essentially having these his children's homes within literally across the street from the father's house. This was designed in 1876 by Edward Townsend Mix, and essentially is textbook centennial style. So this is kind of a modified Gothic that came out of the Philadelphia 1876 exposition. Whenever you see a building of this age, it's essentially 1876 to 1878. It was very popular for a couple of years, and then the 1890s kind of went in, or 1880s went in a different direction. But you can really see this very characteristic style with the William Plankinton home. Inside are two things I'd like to point out. We have the portrait of the patron of the house, John Plankinton, on the easel in the background. And then the more eccentric object in this room is this wonderful floor lamp with the peacock feathers as the shade, and then a kiosk of Plankinton family photographs underneath. So I always call that object the fire starter. It just looks eminently flammable. So the William Plankinton house was sold again at the same time as his father's house to Marquette. And as the Plankintons were in the meatpacking business, I like to call this a Plankinton sandwich. You had the School of Engineering built their school literally right on the front lawn up to the front door of the Plankinton residence in 1941, and then the athletic department, which the offices of which were housed in the William Plankinton house, and then the other part of the athletic department were directly behind this house. And in 1969, that was very carefully removed. And so when you're driving up 16th Street, which is in the lower right-hand corner of your photograph here, and you look over to your, let's see, if you're looking over to your right as you're approaching West Wisconsin Avenue, you can think of this Victorian house just being kind of very tightly tucked into that space, which seems impossible when you see it today. This was an eclectic residence, so now we're moving up to the 1700 block of Grand Avenue. And H.H. Rockwell was a lumber dealer here in Milwaukee, and this house was probably designed by Edward Townsend Mix. It has his 1880s aesthetic style to it, kind of a modified Queen Anne with all these great stained glass windows. The Rockwells didn't stay in the house terribly long, and the house changed hands, and eventually, unbelievably, and you can see some interior photographs, was very fine for that period. The house was carved up into 35 apartments, which is hard to even imagine a Victorian house having 35 units in it, housing 41 tenants. And that was not atypical of what happened to a lot of these Grand Avenue mansions. And that's kind of what's often kind of brought them to being demolished, or in this instance, catching on fire. An older friend of mine, about 20 years ago, who had been a Marquette student in the 1940s, clearly remembered when this fire had occurred. The fire took place on February 14th, 1939. And a fire had broken out in the basement of the house and then just moved quickly through, catching the entire structure on fire. Fortunately, nobody was killed in this fire, but again, this was an incident that brought more legislation about the density of housing in these old mansions and rooming houses. So across the street was the home of Rudolph and Emily Nunemacher. It had actually been built for D.G. Rogers in 1871. The Nunnemachers had moved in by the late 1870s. The Nunnemachers were from an old line Milwaukee family that were in distilling and meatpacking. The forerunner to the Pabst Theater and the Stadt Theater before that was the Nunemacher Opera House, which was on that site. And so they were involved in all sorts of different civic activities. And Emily Nunemacher was also the president of the Milwaukee Children's Hospital Association and was really devoted to the cause of helping out children who were in need. And so eventually she donated her mansion to the Children's Hospital. And in the 1920s, this house was raised in order to make way for the first wing of the Children's Hospital, part of which is Humphrey Hall on Marquette's campus today. Next door to the Nunemacher house was the George Brumder residence. And George Brumder was the largest publisher of German newspapers and books in America at the time. And he purchased this house in 1891, hired Frederick Velguth to remodel it into the present form that you're seeing in this photograph. George passed away in 1910. His widow, Henrietta, stayed in the house until 1924. Their two daughters, Ida and Emma, stayed in the house until 1927 when they moved over to the east side to the Shorecrest Hotel. The family converted the house into a rooming house for Marquette students, and in 1944, it was finally purchased by the Milwaukee Children's Hospital for $25,000, demolished, and then made way for another addition to the hospital. This is a fantastic aerial photo, which I could never imagine that this photo would exist. And it's of the perfect block to capture of Grand Avenue because it really kind of gives you a sense of how these homes were set back from the street, how closely they were built to one another. And again, this is 1920s, and you can already see how commercial things are moving into this neighborhood. So in the lower right-hand corner, you have the early origins of Deaconess Hospital, which would kind of fill that entire block during the mid-20th century. Redeemer Lutheran Church, which is in the middle of the lower part of your screen, was built around 1917, replacing an older mid-19th century house. And so you're starting to see that transformation happening of this neighborhood already in the early 1920s. We have the Pabst Mansion, kind of a little left of center, and a couple of its neighbors, which we'll be visiting shortly. And then you have the Sisters of the Poor ran establishment just behind the Pabst Mansion. So that's the large building that you can see directly behind the Pabst property. So this was a house that fascinated me when I first started working at the Pabst Mansion in 1993. And this was the James Riley house, and I had always known it with this storefront that had been glued onto the front of it. And this was so typical in the mid-20th century to kind of maximize these Victorian homes and what has become kind of a semi-commercial district. So you have the Victorian home, which had been converted into a rooming house, and then you built a commercial building on the front lawn of the house in order to get more income off the property. And so that's what happened to the James Riley house. And so I had always kind of searched out to find what the Riley house looked like at its beginnings. And so in the days before you could search the newspapers on the computer, I started going to UWM and searching the microfilm. And all throughout the 1890s, and I pretty much went through all of the 1890s on microfilm, every Saturday, architects would print their renderings of new large mansions or buildings that they were doing. So Crane and Barkhausen, the architects of the building, presented the James Riley residence in 1897. And so I had kind of a sketchy, this sketch that you're seeing right in front of you. It's just kind of not great, but at least it kind of gave you a sense of where the front porch was, what the tower looked like originally. I was giving this talk in Reedsburg in 2004, and after the talk was over, nice couple came up to me afterwards and they said, "We think you'll really like what we have to share with you." And they gave me this great photo of the Riley House as it appeared shortly after it was constructed. And really, you couldn't ask for a better photograph. You have the Riley's daughter on the front lawn. You have one of the maids in the ballroom window up on the third floor. It's just a great evocative photograph. And the Riley House hung around until 2010, when it was finally demolished, both the old house and the addition to it as well. So going back over to the north side, at 1906 Grand Avenue. So now if you're familiar with the Pabst Mansion, this is 2 doors to the east. And this was always a very desirable part of Spring Street, of Grand Avenue and West Wisconsin Avenue, because you have that rise. It's, you're kind of coming out from downtown and you must have had beautiful views. And a lot of people always ask, so what was the deal with all these towers on these homes? And quite frankly, when you think of the low commercial buildings that were in downtown Milwaukee throughout most of the 19th century, and the rise of this street, you really would have had some beautiful views of the lake, believe it or not, from these towers. But this 1850s house was designed by Edward Townsend Mix. It's always said that this and the Newhall House, which was a hotel downtown, were kind of his 2 earliest commissions. And this was originally a house built for Harrison Luddington. It was soon after purchased by Daniel Wells Jr., who was a kind of early landowner, financier, banker, had built up a very significant fortune of about $10 million when he died in 1902. Wells Street is named after him. The Wells building downtown is named after him. So the Wells name is very much still with us. And so he and his wife, Marcia, had 1 daughter, Fanny. And Fanny Wells married Charles Norris in 1880. They eventually had 1 son, Neil. And Neil continued to stay in this house all the way up until the 1950s. So the Norrises and the Wells were kind of, I wouldn't say slaves to architectural fashion, but they kept up with the times. And so by the turn of the century, they've changed this kind of Italianate house into a more colonial style because that was becoming popular. So the big wraparound porch and this bow front sitting room have been added. The mid-19th century tower has been lowered. So, and everything's been painted white. And so, but the interior of the house has essentially stayed the same as kind of mid 19th century home with high ceilings and everything, except for the dining room. And the dining room was kind of an eccentric exercise in creating what I call a 9th century Nordic banqueting hall. And the person that I attribute this interior design to is George Van Niedecken, who worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. He did these amazing interiors in Milwaukee during the first decade of the 20th century. And he worked in all of these different architectural styles. So I'm putting it on Niedecken that he did this. And clearly this is coming out of the arts and crafts movements in Europe at the time. And so you have all this wrought iron strap work and this heavy carved oak beaming and mortise and tenon elements. All the light fixtures are kind of dragon's heads with gas jets coming out of the tops of their heads. And this 4-foot border that went all the way around the room that was done on pigskin and stenciled with all these Celtic motifs. And the only thing that's really tipping you off that this isn't the 9th century, other than these chairs, is the Johnston system of heat regulation thermostat that's on just to the right of the pocket doors. So Anyway, that's the Wells-Norris interior of this house. Next door was the home of Milwaukee's great architect Henrik Koch. He built this house around 1884. Richardsonian Romanesque. This was a style that he really liked working in for many of Milwaukee's public schools. So this, you'll see architectural elements in those schools to his own private residence. And Koch eventually sold it to the Sevier family, and the Sevier family stayed there for a considerable amount of time. But eventually, during the mid-20th century, this is always a thing that goes straight to the preservationist heart. Will build to suit sign in front of two great Victorian homes. And so you have the Wells-Norris House and the Koch House ready to meet their maker, so to speak. And Neil Norris died in the early 1950s, and so his house was demolished in 1954. And eventually the Koch House was demolished in 1958 to make way for the Holiday Inn. So this particular Holiday Inn, which is now Mashuda Hall, which is a dormitory for Marquette University, its one claim to fame that I know of was that the Beatles stayed there in 1964 when they came to Milwaukee. So that's the one thing I have for this particular Holiday Inn. So next to the Wells-Norris House, the Henry Koch House was the home of Captain Frederick Pabst and his wife Maria and their adult children. And this house replaced an earlier brick structure that was on this site, which I always find interesting. Yeah, I think we all think that these mansions were built on virgin land, but actually several of them had earlier homes on the sites that were torn down to build them. So the Pabsts waited for a lease to expire, broke ground in June of 1890, and this was completed in July of 1892, designed by Farring Kloss, who did many, many great commercial buildings and public buildings, the public library being kind of their supreme public achievement. But Farring Kloss merged their individual architectural practices over this commission, and it was the second most expensive home ever to have been built in Milwaukee, costing $254,000, including everything, the custom furniture, the artwork, and everything. And was truly a remarkable structure, and that happily has been well preserved. But it didn't look like the future was optimistic for the Pabst Mansion in the mid-1970s. Captain Pabst died in 1904, his wife 2 years later in 1906. Their children eventually sold the house to the Milwaukee Archdiocese, Roman Catholic Archdiocese, and this became the home of 5 different archbishops over the course of almost 70 years. And by 1974, the Archdiocese was looking to sell the house, and really the only person that could come up with the money, even though the fledgling organization that was founded to preserve the Pabst Mansion was earnestly trying to purchase it, but didn't have the funds available. The house was sold to a gentleman who owned the Holiday Inn, then the Coach House Inn at that time, with the intent of tearing the Pabst Mansion down for a parking lot. I mean, that story is classic. So eventually, John Conlon became involved. He was a Milwaukee entrepreneur, and he worked out a deal with the people who owned the hotel that because the original carriage house, which was directly behind the Pabst Mansion on a large piece of property, was still there, the carriage house was sacrificed in order for a parking lot for the hotel to be created. So in October 1977, the carriage house was torn down, and then the Pabst Mansion opened as a museum in May of 1978. And just as a little aside, after you have finished with this talk, I encourage all of you to go to www.pabstmansion.com. And during this period of us being closed to the public, I would encourage you to see the virtual tour that has literally just been published this week on the Pabst Mansion's website. So they've done a great job. So you can actually tour the Pabst Mansion virtually right now. So moving on to the next block, or I guess 2 blocks down. I threw this in because I think it's interesting to see how the commercialization of Grand Avenue took place and how early it actually happened. And the zoning changed in 1927 to mixed residential commercial, and that really did spur a lot of commercial developments along the avenue. And a lot of these homes were changed and modified, and lots were subdivided. And so kind of in the foreground of this photograph, you have the residence of Charles Johnston, who was the son of Robert A. Johnston of the Cookie Company. And this little restaurant kind of sidled up to the Johnston House, and this is the Hull Dobbs House, Fine Foods. And as you can see, you know, a little food stand was created there, probably in the early 1930s, and this corner is still very active for quick food bites. And so this is that corner a couple of years ago. This is where the Taco Bell was. And if those Milwaukeeans who have been around here for a while will know that this before was a Taco Bell, it was Zantigo's, one of Milwaukee's first Mexican food kind of takeout places. And now that particular building has been torn down and replaced by a new Taco Bell. So again, we're trying to keep this talk of Grand Avenue all up to date to the moment. So moving 1 block further west, we have the home of Dr. Louis Frank. And this is a Richardsonian Romanesque house built out of red sandstone, red terracotta, and red brick, 1895, designed by William Kimball, who was an architect of the 1890s in Milwaukee, and not a lot is known about him, but he did some really interesting homes during that decade. This is Dr. Louis Frank on the front step of his home. Really great photograph, so you can see the ornaments of the house, but also this sensational wrought iron light fixture done by Cyril Kalnick just on the wall. And Dr. Frank was one of Milwaukee's first dermatologists, but also one of Milwaukee's great classical music lovers. And because of that, he had a 2-story music room added onto his house that featured a residential pipe organ, which I always think is a great touch, and 2 pianos. And he would have his friends come over for these Saturday and Sunday afternoon luncheons, and then they'd retire to the music room and have these quiet concerts in the music room. So their son, Armin, grew up to be an architect. And in the 1920s, he convinced his mother to tear down their family home. And he would be the architect, one of the architects of the building that would rise in its place. And that is the Ambassador Hotel, done by the architects Peacock and Frank. And I always find it sad the Frank house was only 34 years old when it was demolished. So very short history, but we have some great photographs of it. Across the street was the Robert A. Johnston residence. Again, he was the proprietor of the Johnston Cookie Company. This home, very much like the Riley house that was across the street from the Pabst Mansion, designed by Crane and Barkhausen 2 years earlier in 1895, kind of this modified Gothic revival style. Here's a great photograph of the interior stair hall of the mansion, including a photograph of Mrs. Johnston with her daughter-in-law and her granddaughter with this great stained glass window behind them that faced west. So you had this wonderful light that came into the house. Like a lot of Grand Avenue families, they were perplexed by the growing commercialization of the street. And so by 1920, they decided to move to another part of the city and converted the house into a rooming house. And then later in 1934, it was sold and then demolished to make way for a Standard Oil gas station, which then gave way to a scrub-a-dub car wash. So again, things are always changing, but you can kind of see right between those two apartment buildings where the Johnston house once had been. Franz Woolgar had built this Italianate shortly after he was married to a daughter of John Prietzloff of the Prietzloff Hardware Company, and Woolgar had gone to work for the firm as well. And the Woolgars stayed in this house until the early 1920s, when it was sold in 1923 to the Eagles Club. And so the Eagles Club were going to have their offices in this building and then build their quarters elsewhere. But they decided, because the Woolgar property was so deep, that they would actually build the new Eagles Club in the backyard of the Woolgar House. And so you can see the Woolgar House on the right, and the Eagles Club is rising in the garden of the Woolgar House, designed by Russell Barr Williamson, who was the kind of a supervising architect that worked with Frank Lloyd Wright for a time, and became an architect of note in his own right. And so eventually the Woolgar House was swept away from the front of the completed club, which opened in 1927, and today is the Rave, and the building is still standing and is definitely a Milwaukee landmark in its own. So across the street, I always like to say across the street from the McDonald's at 24th and West Wisconsin was originally the largest, the most expensive home ever to have been built in Milwaukee. It cost $300,000 when it was completed in 1889, which, if you were adjusting for the cost of labor and materials, you'd probably be looking somewhere upward of $40 million today, which is crazy to think about, but it is true. So it was based on a Rhinish castle that Lisette Schandein and her husband Emil had seen in Germany. Emil Schandein was the vice president of the Philip S. Brewing Company, which was eventually became the Pabst Brewing Company. Lisette was originally Lisette Best, so she was a daughter of the owner of the Best Brewing Company, and so she was the second largest shareholder next to Captain and Mrs. Pabst in the Pabst Brewing Company, and was for 5 years the vice president of the Pabst Brewing Company. Her husband died halfway through the construction of this house, so she had to complete it on her own. She referred to it as the big box that never brought her any luck anyway. So it's this kind of this huge exercise in building this amazing house. The property had originally been owned by Cyrus Hawley, and this was the original Hawley house that was on that huge entire lot piece of property. And Lisette Schandein preserved it as a guest cottage. And I finally just kind of put all those pieces together with a photograph just a few years ago. And so this is, you can see those steps are actually coming down from the back side of the Schandein Mansion onto the driveway. And that's the old mid, 1860s cottage that the Hawleys had, and it had been preserved. So some amazing photography of this house. It was featured in 1890 magazine article in Cosmopolitan. It was highly described, so we have some really good idea of the kind of the decoration and the size of this house. I've always said you could put a locomotive into the front hall of this. And really this house had a scale that was unlike anything else in Milwaukee at any time, let's be honest. So essentially the hall was 16 feet wide, 15 feet tall, and about 35 feet long. And so really a huge front hall. This is looking up the grand staircase. The lightly draped maiden that's holding up, essentially serving as the newel post for the grand staircase, was carved by the architect himself for an extra $1,000. And so that's 1/300th of the cost of the house went into the carving of that statue. The Turkish parlor, which of course every mansion of the 1880s should definitely have had. and numerous formal parlors. This is one of the French parlors with mahogany furniture and woodwork. Make sure you remember those pocket doors that are in the background of the photograph because they'll be mentioned in a moment. So Lisette Schandein eventually decided to leave Milwaukee in 1903. She moved to Berlin, Germany. She died there in 1905. And the house really kind of sat empty and eventually was taken over by the city. And the city didn't know what to do with it and was eventually carved up into 13 apartments. And then they couldn't figure out a way to heat it efficiently. And so in 1927, again, it was decided to pull it down. And again, it was 38 years old when it was demolished. And there's a great quote in the Milwaukee papers from the demolition foreman. And he said that really because this house was so Victorian that very little could be salvaged, one of the things that was saved were the pocket doors because they could be reused as garage doors, which I think of, if any back alley in Milwaukee still has Schandein pocket doors surviving as garage doors, be pretty remarkable. So kind of our last home tonight, we're going to kind of skip all the way to the end of kind of the mansion end of Grand Avenue. And this, I always refer to this as kind of the last big mansion to have been built on Grand Avenue. It was built in 1904 for Henry Harshberger. And this was designed by Eugene Liebert, who designed the Bergenthal remodel that we had talked about earlier. And this is in the new German Renaissance style. So he was very up to the minute, 1905, and he worked with George Mann-Niedecken on doing the interior of the house, which must have been space age from the small details I've been able to put together. The Milwaukee Art Museum has Niedecken's original renderings for some of the rooms here, and he was drawing heavily from the Vienna secession style that was popular in Vienna in 1904, 1905. So very stylized furniture, and the Harshbergers had about 20 years in this house, but I'm sure they thought in 1905 that they were at the safe end of Grand Avenue, far enough away from downtown Milwaukee. And when this little electric car rolled up in front of the house, they should have taken it as an omen of the things to come. Because by the mid-1920s, a gas station had been built just to the left of this photograph, and a Buick dealership and a Chevrolet dealership had arrived across the street. And so eventually, Henry Harshberger was completely boxed in by a gas station and car dealerships, and then the final straw was a 3-story apartment building was built right up to the lot line on the right side of this photograph. And so it cut out all the eastern light into his house. And so he sold the house. It was carved up into 19 apartments, and then he decamped and moved over to the east side of Milwaukee. And here we see the Harshberger House as it looked kind of in the 1960s when Humphrey Chevrolet had their used car lots on that corner. And up until relatively recently, I've always kind of worried about the Harshberger House because it almost got caught up in what I call the Walgreen-Osco wars of the 1990s. Walgreens had built on that western corner of 35th and Wisconsin, and Osco was looking to acquire this piece of property along with Harshberger House, demolish the Harshberger House, and build huge Osco on that corner. And there was talk of moving the Harshberger House to a different part of the city, of taking it down. Unfortunately, when Veterans Manor was built there on that corner in 2011, I think I'm feeling that the Harshberger House might be here for the long haul. So I'd like to thank everybody. I really hope that you've enjoyed this this time that we've spent together tonight. And also that, this is just another great example of why we always have to, preserve the things that we have in our community, because things can go so quickly. So, John, I'm more than happy to take any questions if anybody wants to share any questions.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't. Can we give just a round of applause? It's a weird.
I'm sorry, that was a lot longer. Oh dear,
No,
I'm really sorry.
You
I'm
did
sorry.
great. No, it's an interesting experience to see it on this end.
1 hour exactly. When I was supposed to do
know that the most people we had turning in at one time though was over 570 people.
Oh, great.
So that's
and then they left. Now we only have 2.
No, we still have over 530. So right now is time for people to put their questions in. And if you have any questions for John or for anything that happened near these places, that now is the time to put them in. I guess I'll start it off though. And so I feel sometimes very conflicted about historic preservation. Because I'll tell you that the number one sound I made during the last hour of your presentation was, ugh. Because every time you show,
I miss that. I miss that when I'm doing it live. It's like,
I'm sure it's like an echo, right? It's this big cacophony of sound. But every time you showed a house getting demolished, and I knew every time you were going there because when driving home from work was a thing, I would often drive down Wisconsin,
right?
And looking at it now, it looks very different than what you saw. So as a preservationist, you talked about when like Captain Pabst bought that land, there was another structure on that land. Right. So he was anti-preservationist and knocking that structure.
I guess he was.
But so, at what point, is it important? We save these, all these houses are magnificent. At what point do we take inventory of other structures that are more contemporary?
Absolutely. And I advocate for mid-century buildings all the time, which is, it's the other side of me. There's the Victorian side, but there are also great buildings like the Marine Plaza building downtown, one of Milwaukee's great mid-century buildings. So it's like you have to think of, I think, obviously you can't save everything.
Sure.
And to me, it's like you're weighing the design, you're weighing the integrity of the structure. That's why I think a lot of people were latching on to saving the Pabst Mansion in the 70s, the Elizabeth Plankinton homes. These were homes that kind of, everything was kind of still there. The Pabst Mansion was very lucky that never became a rooming house. It was essentially a single family home its entire time, and with the Archdiocese living there. And
so it's almost a blessing that the Archdiocese had it.
Oh, for sure. I can guarantee that if they hadn't taken it over, it would have been exactly what happened to the Schandein House, where it was just, it made it for about 35, 40 years, and then it was just demolished. So,
sure.
Yeah.
So our first question comes from Jennifer. What role does the city play in preserving the buildings and mansions that are still around, and can they stop demolition?
That's a very good question. So we have the historic preservation department part of city, and so they're the ones that really kind of monitor buildings, nominate them for status. But I never feel like everything is or nothing is formally safe. It's like it depends. There are so many different moving parts. So you can have things on the National Register. You can have things that are locally designated. So it's tough. We all kind of have to like keep an eye out for kind of special things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think this is actually a good question, just because we've been on for a little while, and maybe there needs to be a reminder. But what is your background? How did you come into being an architectural historian of Milwaukee?
So it's kind of something that I've really been interested in. I grew up in Southern California in a small town halfway between Los Angeles and Palm Springs that was settled by Midwesterners in the 1880s. So there's a lot of Victorian architecture. So that was something I was really interested in. And when I was 12 years old, I spoke at my first city council meeting for the preservation of a house that was being threatened with demolition. So if I'm doing that at 12, that was something that
you're on your track.
I was motivated. So then Well, it was time to go to college. My undergrad is in American history. I have an art history minor, and then when I went to grad school, I specialized in kind of Gilded Age era. So I'm more of a social historian, and then I had the interest in architecture on top of that. So, and then being at the Pabst Mansion for over 2 decades, that that really kind of solidified that interest in architectural history. And plus, Milwaukee is such a, I always call it small Milwaukee, because everything is so interconnected, and so these families were so intermarried, and using the same architects. So it really is kind of an interesting puzzle to kind of pull apart.
Yeah, it's definitely a kind of a collage.
Yeah.
So, and this is something I've always wanted to know is, when did the street name change from Grand Avenue to Wisconsin?
It is it's 26 or 27. So it's right around that time.
Why?
That the zoning was changing. I think it was, okay, so east of the river was Wisconsin Street, not east or west. It was just Wisconsin Street. And west of the river was Grand Avenue, not West Grand Avenue. So at some point, somebody thought, well, let's just make it all Wisconsin Avenue, east and west. And that's how that happened. And that was in 1927. I think the grand part of it was becoming really tarnished, quite frankly. I mean, a lot of these homes were, as you're moving into the 30s, a lot of this happened before the Depression, but as you're going through the Depression era and in the World War II era, when you couldn't get materials to fix these places, families were just walking out. I mean, on Prospect Avenue, people were just like moving out, and all of a sudden you have like abandoned mansions. And so I think the grand name was becoming kind of more ironic than something that was actually representing beautiful tree-lined avenue.
Well, and I think that also puts a perspective on why a lot of these homes ended up getting demolished if they weren't useful.
Right.
And I don't know if you look at like the Pabst Mansion today, and when we're under normal circumstances, you can go visit it as a tourist attraction.
Right.
But it doesn't sound like that was the thought in the 1920s as far as when did the preservation movement kind of start in Milwaukee then?
Okay, so the Pabst Mansion, the saving of the Pabst Mansion really was the turning point. So Milwaukee had lost its, really jewel box art gallery. The Leighton Art Gallery went down in 57. Both train stations went down in 64 and 68. And so it was the taking down of the Chicago Northwestern station along the lake that really was kind of seen as a kind of a gut check. It was like, oh, maybe we've pulled too much down now.
Sure.
It's kind of weird that a Midwestern city lost both of its train stations. St. Louis has done such a great job with reincorporating their train station into the community. And so that happened in the late 60s. And so then you have in the mid 70s this push to save the Pabst Mansion. I think a lot of people saw that as, okay, this is worth saving. This definitely should be saved. And, a lot of people got behind it. It had one of the largest state grants to save it at the time. And, but then you had the Plankinton house being torn down 2 years later. So it wasn't always like a forward path. It was saving and losing at the same time. But I would say the Pabst Mansion really was like the turning point in the preservation movement.
You mentioned the Plankingtons and Elizabeth Plankington, and somebody sent us a message. Is that the same Elizabeth Plankington that passed away in the 80s?
Different.
Okay.
Yeah. Elizabeth Plankington, I think, died in the 1920s. I'd have to look it up quick. Okay. But the original Elizabeth Plankington, there were other Elizabeth Plankingtons in that family over time. So, but the original one died earlier in the 20th century.
What a burden to carry.
I know, that poor house really kind of had like this dark cloud over it like the whole time,
Yeah, that was the first in the presentation.
I know that it's so funny because whenever I'm giving this talk and we're all in the room together, there's always I don't even say one word, and that photograph comes up of just the house, and everybody like automatically recognizes it as, this moment, this loss,
Sure. So Donna says, after Grand Avenue became a commercial district, where did the wealthy families build their homes?
They headed over to the east side for in large, over to Lake Drive.
So this would have been around what time period then? The 20s?
Even earlier, I would say beginning shortly after the turn of the century. I mean, the Pabst Mansion sat on the real estate market for 3 years before it finally found a buyer for less than half of what it cost to build the house. They really kind of gave a sweetheart deal to the archdiocese because these homes just weren't moving. So already by, I'd say 1905, 1910, you have Wall Avenue, Terrace Avenue, the beginnings of Lake Drive, start to develop during that era. Yeah. So it really does perfectly match the car. It's as soon as people can like drive further away, and that's one of the reasons why Grand Avenue developed in the first place. It was close enough by horse and carriage to downtown, but was removed, a little bit, but still close. But the car just really allowed people to start going out to Wauwatosa or up to Fox Point and Shorewood, so you can see how these suburbs quickly start developing in the 20s.
Well, and I suppose as even further suburban migration takes place during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, these buildings become even harder to maintain.
Yeah.
So
absolutely,
that makes sense. I think we'll take just a couple more questions, and then we'll probably give you a bourbon break, John.
Thank you.
I think so. Chelsea says, "Do you have any written works?"
I do. I have my book on the Pabst Mansion. I have a book on Pabst Farms, and I co-authored with Eric Vogel a history of the latent art collection, which essentially is a in-depth look at Milwaukee's fine art culture from the 1860s, 1870s, all the way to the present day. So it really kind of covers the latent art gallery and the creation of the art museum and the war memorial on the east side. I'm working on another book on Gustav Pabst, 3 generations of Gustav Pabst Sr., Jr., and the third. So that's kind of a 3-generational biography as well. So I've got some other Milwaukee topics up my sleeve that I'm working on.
Right. There are plenty of, it seems like after doing this, there's a lot of comments are like, can you do my neighborhood?
Yeah.
I'm sure you get that a lot.
Well, it's funny, preparing for this, I was just like, I really want to do a book on Grand Avenue, but it's just like, it gets so complicated just getting all the dates and the people right and everything. So it's such a great, the photographs are really amazing.
Yeah. Well, and trying to, it seems like a lot of different narratives going into one street, which is very interesting. So it's it's really interesting that way. Well, with that, somebody asked what your favorite bourbon is, so we'll just end with that one. That's
okay. Favorite bourbon, let's see. I'm a big Bullet guy. I love Bullet bourbon, so that's my favorite. That's my
well, with that,
bourbon, Willets, it's just it can go on. It can go on. But I just want to do a shout out to the County Historical Society as well, and very rich photo archives that they have, which a lot of them were, in this presentation tonight, but it is such an incredible resource for the city, to preserve this, because some of these homes, all we have is a single photo and that's it, these beautiful places. And it's like the Bergenthal House. If my mom hadn't picked up both of those photos at the same time, we wouldn't have that great connection of those 2 projects. So
sure, yeah, and it's important when people find things to donate them to places that save them.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fun to hang them on your walls, but you can donate them and still scan them now. And
exactly.
It's fun that way too. Well, so John Eastberg, in case you're suddenly turning in at the end, so a longtime Pabst Mansion related historian, and as well as a Milwaukee architectural historian. He's got a bunch of books if you search his name on Boswell. I say go to Boswell because Jeff Bezos has plenty.
Absolutely. Support local.
You know, yeah, the Pabst Mansion carries your titles.
And Daniel's the best. So,
yeah,
we should support him.
Yeah. So so make sure you support local, not only local museums, but also local authors in these things. But thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate you.
I hope this wasn't too incredibly weird.
That we're all learning things. So.
Yeah, we'll do another one a week from today at 6:30. Tom Fearing talking about the magnificent machines of Milwaukee. So all about Milwaukee innovation. So we're gonna just hunker down and get through this as best as we can. So we're all in this together, and we hope to see you next Thursday. Make sure you tune in the Milwaukee County Historical Society Facebook page. Also, thanks this week for the co-presenter of the Pabst Mansion for collaborating with us on this talk too. So take it easy, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you later.